Welcome, everyone, to the show. Today, we are talking about demystifying leadership as a set of relational and conversational skills. And with me today for this conversation is Kyle Courtaway, managing partner, leadership development consultant from Ninth Edge out of Chicago, Illinois. Kyle, thanks for coming today.
I'm glad to be here. It's great to be with you, Ken.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to start with just tell us your story. I'd love to hear how you even got into this line of business, let alone, lead us into what you're doing today.
I mean, there's a little bit of probably where we end, which is always in the story at the beginning, right? Which is the first thing is going back to the place where it's most interesting is probably an individual who finishing up their college had no idea what they wanted to do. And so that's the perfect way you end up in grad school. Let me recognize that.
Yes.
If you don't know what you want to do, but
just go to more school.
Just go to more school. Yeah. I ended up luckily, falling into a graduate program that was it's an interdisciplinary program, but it was focused on communication. Right. And I'm also going to tell you that in my practice right now, I'm going to tell you it's one of my least favorite words. Like I tell almost everybody, if you could say one word, if you could erase the word communication from your vocabulary, erase it, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. But I do remember sitting in a seminar when I was once in that program and thinking, I'm actually being able to have conversations with people about the way we talk to one another. And at that stage, that was something pretty transformative, at least for me. The idea that there actually was a vocabulary to describe how we were doing what we're doing, right? If you think about the David Foster Wallace idea, like when he gives that speech where he talks about what's water, right? The idea that you're swimming in something you don't even know you're swimming in. Most of us have a way that we interact with folks, but we don't have the vocabulary for how we interact with folks. We learn that later on. Fast forward to my first real job as I ended up in professional services. What was Arthur Andersen eventually became Accenture.
Oh, okay.
And like all the way back to the big 8 consulting firms, if you will. And I was with them, and I was actually, believe it or not, my role was actually in an internal role within the Andersen ecosystem. And we were part of a 200-person group that focused on organizational development, and leadership development, and assessment and instructional design. And I did that work for a number of years, and I actually shifted from various teams. So I started in the instructional design space, moved over to leadership and team development, eventually ended up in organizational development. And then at some point, if you know the story of that organization, they melted down quite spectacularly. And I was looking for new opportunities, and that was so many years ago. And interestingly, for a while, because for those of you who don't know, Arthur Andersen, as an accounting firm at the time, was caught up in the Enron scandal, which eventually created issues around the trustworthiness of advisory organizations like public accounting firms. And being someone who actually focused on leadership development in an organization, that was not lost on me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so your role was sort of more of an internal HR role, kind of.
That's right. That's exactly what it was. Yeah. So I was developing partners. I was developing leaders that, like, inside an organization. The interesting thing about if you go all the way back, that organization actually won awards for its at least how much it invested in it. And that was a 65,000 person organization at the time, global.
Yeah.
And I was able to work with really smart people who were really good at what they did. But something I'll point to a little bit later is the first place I saw an example of something I'm sure you've seen before too, which is this. You've got someone who's a really good accountant, really good tax accountant, really good business consultant, and then we say, you know what? Now what you're going to do is congratulations. I got an opportunity for you, and you're going to lead this team, and then we're going to see what happens. And inevitably, when you got someone who, by definition, your price of admission is just being super smart, they were going to super smart their way through this thing,
of course,
without the recognition of, okay, well, what do I actually need to learn? What do I need to unlearn? What do I need to let go of? What do I need to pick up along the way? And so my first opportunity within that organization, my first coaching client, I was 27 years old, and I was coaching one of the managing partners who was 20 years my senior. And my first thought is, what do I have to share with this person that's going to be of any value, right?
Yeah.
But you learn along the way. Anyway, I bring that up to say I started in that space, financial services, professional services. When that stopped, I actually stepped away from the corporate world for a bit. I actually worked in I worked in the outdoors. I did some wilderness guiding. I worked in addiction recovery, but mostly what it all had in common was I just wanted to be able to facilitate conversations with people. Whatever we were trying to do, because that was the thing I think energized and interested me in some way, shape, or form. Eventually came back, and I started working with some different smaller boutique firms, and it's still in the same space, right?
Mhm.
So we're now talking about how can what data predicts who's going to be good when we put them in the next role? What are they going to need when they get there? How do you facilitate them getting there without creating any, as little damage as possible and helping them along the way? So you would see that process in my career. That's what I did, and I can tell you to this day, I still have a significant amount of passion around it. I feel very lucky that that's the case. At some point, and I think this might be where we even interacted. The Corn Ferry organization was looking for what they were describing as a group of master faculty, meaning people who could facilitate some of their public certifications, which meant how do you help teach tools? How do you help facilitate learning? How do you certify people in the use of those? And I was part of, I think we started out with 14 people and ended up whittling it down to like 2. And I was one of those folks, and I was
Yeah.
lucky enough to do that for about 7 or 8 years, working as part of that team and working with some great tools. And it's also there where I think when I talk about the idea of demystifying leadership, I really come to one of the first things that really hit me. And I think it does go back to the nature of where I began, which is, and I say this all the time to my clients, which is to be able to do what you need to do to be successful, you learn a language you don't even know you learned that's quite precise. Meaning the technical side of almost any function of any business has a level of precision because that shared meaning allows us to do what we need to do. It doesn't matter if it's the commercial side, the R&D side, the operations, supply chain, regulatory, doesn't matter. However, someone tells you now need to be a great leader. And the first thing you learn is that you have this, what I would describe as a fluency comprehension problem. Everybody uses all the same words, and everybody just means different things by those.
Yeah.
And the other piece is no one shows up to being a leader as a blank slate. Like they've all been shaped by the leaders that have led them in the past, whether or not they even know how, right? Most of the time we know that, when it comes to the better leaders that we've worked with, like they kind of set the emotional tone that we want to establish when they're in that space. The not so great leaders teach us the things we never want to do to other people, right? But again, we still show up with this basket of experiences, but that's not necessarily a sense of, well, what does it really mean I'm being asked to do here?
Yeah. Well, and those transitions take people. So you've stumbled into the, like, perhaps we have both have the same hot button issue. Um, you know, so where was I going with that? Which is, it's not just the first level of leadership where you have to really learn, right? It's actually every single level you have this need to unlearn and relearn, what is now needed at this new level. And the trap that most people fall into is, I'm just going to do more of what I was doing before, just more. We're just hard,
Right.
white knuckled
Yeah,
it through.
absolutely.
And so let me just stick with hot button issue.
Please.
Hot button issue for me, because
Yeah. I'm glad I found one.
well, and we talked about this, and so I've talked about this a lot in all of my external consulting experiences, but then it was really seeing this play out inside organizations myself, right, where
Yeah.
we are creating succession plans, developing leaders, and then hoping to have people ready and enact these succession plans when there is that opening, and then sitting there.
By the way, if we're doing it right,
If we're
that's what
doing
we're
it
trying to
right,
do.
yes,
If we're doing it right, I mean, I would say if you're doing that, you're 10 steps ahead of most people that you're even, even thinking that succession
the
perspective. Anyway,
percentage,
didn't interrupt.
no, it's spot on, because it's the percentage of the time when we actually enact those succession plans is very low. Now, is that because the process is broken, and are we wasting our time? No. I would say absolutely not.
No. Yeah,
as long as you're doing something in the near term after creating these succession plans, that's caveat. Like, are we actually saying, what does this person need to develop, and are we going to put our time, effort, investment into that? Then it's not wasted time, because the problem is you can't predict the context of the point in time when that opening occurs.
That's right.
But let me fast forward to
by the way, happens. 20 places my brain wants to go with this. It's so good. Keep going.
Yeah, wherever you want to go next. What I would say is, what I think kind of broke my heart time and time again was watching people get placed, and I was never in the role where it was my role to focus on that one person and transitioning them when I was inside HR.
Right.
But it's the lack of focus and truly helping that person make that step up into that new level. And then catching wind of, if not being in the conversation 6, 12, 18 months down the road, where we're having this conversation of, essentially, it's time to put this person on a performance improvement plan. This person who we once thought walked on water is now a performance problem. And as any HR person will tell you, when it comes time for a PIP, there probably was, let alone, not even just about having chosen, potentially the thought that we chose the wrong leader. Sure. Any HR person will tell you, if we're getting to the point of a PIP, there is leadership failure every step of the way if we're now at a PIP, right? That feedback and support. So I digress to say, the thing that broke my heart time and time again was catching wind, or being a part of these conversations where we are thinking about, how do we exit this person that we once thought was great? And the reality is, there was so much more that should have been done to help that person, because, again, everybody's instinct is, well, I'm just going to do what got me here, just on steroids. And that's
right.
Yeah.
So go and stay with that "what got me here" thing, because one of the things I'll often say is if you look at the aggregate data of what price of admissions you into this space to begin with, and I recognize I just created a verb out of a noun, so I apologize about that.
It's not the first time on the podcast.
Here's what I could probably, and again, I'm not trying to take away that every candidate, every individual has got their own unique set of gifts that they bring to the table. I'm not suggesting that, but here's what I at least could say would tell me from an aggregate perspective what likely got you there in the first place. Okay. You're probably a little more action oriented than most. You're probably a little more results driven than most. You tend to be good at keeping your commitments, even if it burns you out.
Yep, accountability.
And you likely figure out who your customer is pretty fast. Who do you got to keep happy? Meaning, if I knew nothing about you, but I needed to take an educated guess about what got you here to begin with, right? When you say the "what got you here" piece. Well, all we need to do for a moment is say, what's the white knuckle version of those 4 qualities look like? And you can pretty well start predicting what your 6, 9, 12 months looks like from that perspective. And that would be understandable.
Yep.
We would get, what does the overuse of action-oriented, results-driven, keeping commitments, like, these are all good things, right? These are, it's even hard to imagine, like, customer focus. What's wrong with that? Like, I get that. And this, by the way, gets a little bit later on about what my advice is to other leaders, but I'll say it right here is, do you know what overuse looks like? Do you know when you've tipped into it? Because most of us don't.
Right.
Like if I'm grabbing if I'm grabbing the wheel like you're describing, I don't know what too tight is. I know I know I haven't gripped tight enough if I'm not getting what I want.
Yeah.
So I say that this idea of, how do you help somebody when they find themselves in that position, with the recognition that the vocabulary of leadership is one that we've evolved and developed along the way, but I'm not sure it's super precise. If an example might be if someone who leads me asked for I could really I'll use just this word just because it's very easy. I could use more support from you. I'm never going to say no, and I have absolutely no idea what you're really asking for, and it could
Yes.
literally be the list of 30 different things.
Yep.
So I started again back to the idea that it was simply a recognition that we often had really precision definitions of the technical side of what got you successful.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't always have precise definitions. By the way, precise and practical ones, right? You and I have both gone down the list of creating speak that could be helpful for those in the know, but for someone who's got to step into this relationship, do I actually have something practical that describes and defines for me what's important in this space? And most leaders spend 3 to 5 years trying to figure that out, and that's okay. That's the way that goes. The other thing that again, we can talk about research-based, I'll use the metaphor of the periodic table of elements of leadership behaviors, right? Whichever research-based visual you want to use, you're eventually going to get a 80-85% overlap with those behaviors because they're the same behaviors. Now you just need to get some sort of precision about what it looks like. So at the very least, can I help those leaders stepping into it? Do we have something that at least starts outlining the new landscape you stepped in? Because to your perspective, most leaders just say, I'm in the same old environment. I'm just going to do this more.
Yeah. And it's easier. It's accessible for most people when you're explaining that first time leadership experience.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's the easiest to explain there. Because it's like, well, now you were an individual contributor. Now you're managing individual contributors. But the trap that people fall into is, no, I'm just going to be a super individual contributor.
I'll be a super individual contributor.
More done. That's the easiest to explain. But I literally, when I was working in the restaurant industry, I literally heard this from a store GM going to be a regional manager. He's like, oh yeah, I mean, now I manage 5 restaurants. And I'm like, do you manage 5 restaurants or do you manage 5 restaurant managers? Like, which is it? But it gets more. The challenges are eerily similar, but it gets harder to explain what that really feels like at higher levels.
So one of the places we actually find ourselves, and I mean in our organization, we actually spend a lot more time at the director level now.
Yeah.
And a case that we would make is, and again, I recognize that that level could look very different depending on the organization, right? Director, senior director space. But there is something to be said that, to your point, there's almost a bit of a perfect storm in that space, which is to step in can feel like, oh, it's just the same thing, just a greater degree, without recognizing there actually is another fundamental transition, but this one's kind of hiding in plain sight. And then there's another space, which is when you hit that, I mean, to me, this is like, there's a little, that space probably sees more of the organization than any other space, meaning that the pure landscape of the organization that it sees and the pure landscape of the organization it must influence. Because if you think about, I have people that might report to me, but now my ability to develop peer relationships is becoming that much more important to be able to get my work done, obviously being able to translate the vision that's being handed to me. I think you're right that things get missed in that next transition. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, and I like how you've been kind of teeing up language, right? Words matter, right?
Words matter.
And I'd say one of my favorite examples personally that, I had to learn primarily in my time in HR, but I've very clearly taken it with me into my, back into consulting, that I'm doing now is just one example of like bringing your stakeholders along. And a hard lesson I had to learn was defining what the heck that means with each the key stakeholder for a project, is to say, hey, everybody says you got to bring your stakeholders along. Tell me what that means to you. What does that look like to you? What and if I do what,
Yes.
you will feel like I have brought you along.
Yeah.
Like let's chalk the field on that, because I don't want to get to month 3 or 6 and hear you're not bringing stakeholders along very well.
That's right. It would be especially frustrating if you feel like you've also been putting effort into try to making it happen.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Like it hasn't been something that's just been going over your head. If you've been giving conscious energy to this thing that you know and accept is important, but because of some sort of strange trick of language, we've never actually gotten to understanding what that means.
Yeah.
So the version is bringing your stakeholders along. Mine is alignment. Anytime I hear that term,
We need alignment. What does
sure,
that mean?
like well, and in my somewhat semi-humorous statement around this is the quicker we're nodding our heads, the less likely we are in agreement. Like if you and I, of course, yeah, who's gonna like
I've
if
been
there is
nodding my head this
if there's
entire
yeah
conversation.
yeah.
Keep going.
Well, so eventually, to me, what does start showing up is okay. So oh, over time, I'm gonna I'll share in terms of why I think demystifying leadership is important is because I could probably get on Amazon right now, and there has been a leadership book released today, literally today. There is no shortage of points of view around this, and there's no shortage of the quote unquote right way to do things. I do tend to take a fairly material view of leadership that says leadership is fundamentally an influence process. And you do it primarily by the relationships you build and the conversations that you have. And the moment that I can do that, I have at least put some boundaries around things that says, tell me about the key partners you work with, tell me about the conversations you got to have. And you tell me about those things, and I'll tell you about your leadership, right? Because at that point, what we've done is we've gotten the best way I can frame it is a boots on the ground perspective on what it really means for you to lead others. Now we've at least said, okay, there are people that I need to build relationship with.
Yeah. Yep.
And and I'm going to have to do that primarily through having conversations. Now, again, if we want to go back to where I began, which was the word communication, the one thing that, again, we talk about the head nodding fast, meaning we don't know what we mean. And I don't think it's out of a bad thing, but the word communication, the number of times we land on the prescription is we need better communication. I am not disagreeing with that. I I do think I like the idea that we sometimes, in our language, we sometimes reach for our intent quicker than we can find our precision. Like, we know it's there, but for whatever reason, it really hasn't gotten at the thing. So that's why one of the things I often say to if I'm coaching someone and that some of those words start trickling in, I'll say, if you couldn't use that word, what would you use? Like if the phrase is I need better communication with this individual, I'd say, okay,
What?
can't use that word. You
What
got to
does
tell me
that
what you
mean?
mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of starting to get at, okay, what I really need to be doing is building more consistency in my touch points with them. Okay, great. That's communication, but that's something we can talk about. Or I need to actually learn how to stay present and listening to this individual, especially when we're getting to the point where I'm once again in disagreement with them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's also communication, but a completely different skill set.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So if my listeners can get half of what I get out of these conversations, then I'm doing my job as a podcaster, myself appointed job as a podcaster.
That's great.
Because I think I'm finding in real time to be true very much what I think you said at the beginning. I'm going to put it in my own language, which is I laugh because that's what we're kind of talking a lot about language
I
today.
tracked it. I got it. I'm right there with you.
Is what I love is the intentionality you're bringing to, I think, some of how I've been interacting as a coach with the people that I work with. But I love the intentionality you're bringing to the precision of language, right? Words matter. Um, I just love it because I think some of the things I'm running through in my head are some of the coaching experiences that I've had, some of the challenges that I've been chatting with, people I've been coaching and talking through with them. I'm even thinking about the idea of, and I think you were saying this, is like building relationships, right? That's a whole competency.
Huge.
Right? There's PDI had probably, I don't know how many behaviors, let alone anchored rating scales that say, well, here's what a 1 looks like and a 3 looks like.
That's right.
But did we even define what that means in the context of the seat you're currently sitting in, right? When you're,
there we go.
Okay, so we're saying you need, one thing that's going to be needed here is building relationships. But are we actually pausing and slowing down and stopping? And I think when I'm saying we here, I think I'm just putting myself in the shoes of a leader who's just been positioned and their manager. Have we even stopped to say, build relationships with whom?
Yeah.
For why? And to do what? Right. And because, and just picking that apart, because I think, you might get brought in to coach someone, or they might say, hey, this person really needs to work on building relationships, right? And it's
and by the way, often when a coach gets brought in, it's because of something relationally to begin with, because what started relationally is now showing up as a performance metric of some kind. Go ahead. Sorry,
no, perfect. I think maybe I'm just meandering. So I'm trying to think where was I going with that, which is, are we talking about, do they need to build better relationships with their direct reports? Is that falling apart in some way? Is it, and even just saying you need to build relationships with peers is still pretty broad. Yes. Well, which peers? The peers that all report to the same leader? Or are we saying like, hey, this salesperson, this sales leader needs to actually build relationships with folks in marketing, folks in customer service,
cross-functionally,
or are we just saying they need to build relationships with the other sales leaders? Like, who are we? Yeah. So I think I'm meandering to say, like, I'm personally going to be chewing on this, I think, and taking it into conversations with people, because I feel like I do this already, but what I like I like the intentionality that you're bringing to this.
Well, there was something you raised before, which is, it's the space in the conversation from the internal HR perspective is when we're looking at the data, and the data suggests this person is going to be a fit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've certainly given energy to having the right data, and are we measuring the right things, and how confident do we feel in this? And then we did the fast forward 9 to 12 months. If we find ourselves in the why didn't that work? What was the fit element around that? And let's recognize it. It's a group of people who are doing their best. No one's trying to set somebody up for failure. No one's trying to create challenges around that. There is probably a wider range of ways that an individual contributor can find success. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't a wide range of ways that leaders can be successful. I don't mean that at all. It just means that the nature of influence becomes more relational. And at that point, you've got this little, it's like the difference between it's an oversimplification, but it's the difference between a case study and role play. And all I mean by that is, a case study is a place where I can talk safely about what I would do, right? When you give me the case, what I go is, well, what I'll do is, and I'll tell you my plan. Case study, you never see how I'd actually do it. Role play is the place where my mouth opens and you see what actually occurs.
Yeah.
So I'm not, they both are good things, but it is kind of the difference between, we're doing our best from getting them set up. But that's why when I think about the leader who's actually in the position where the rubber often hits the road is in how I'm creating, managing, and building relationships, and how I'm having conversations on a day-to-day basis, right? Because those are the little things that are going to be the bricks in the wall that either are going to show up 9 to 12 months from now. And here's the other piece, because you talked about kind of the research-based element on this, and I'll always keep it was an internal white paper I remember that just talked about that not all competencies, not all skills, are all developmentally equally easy or hard, right? That there are just differing levels of difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
What stuck out in my brain, and it never left, was The extent to which something was more developmentally difficult was based on its cognitive complexity, the extent to which it required expertise to get good, the extent to which it challenged our beliefs, the challenge to which it required us to use or manage our emotional systems, right? So the harder something got, you're just talking about the things that are involved in what makes it good or not.
Yeah.
You don't need all of that to white knuckle. But to step into, I now need to be able to connect to cross-functional leaders that I work with. I need to know how to faithfully report back to my team what occurred so they feel like they got this straight story. But guess what? I'm also now in a position where as a leader, I'm being asked to be transparent and be more authentic. Well, what the heck do those things mean, right?
While also being asked, because the other, just right along what you're talking about here, a trap I find leaders falling into, while also representing the company.
There you go.
To your direct reports too. Right?
That's right. Yeah. And I could, and by the way, if we want to think of the needle tipping into overuse or not enough of something, I talk to leaders all the time about the challenge that they're in about being transparent as a value versus being transparent as a skill. Meaning, I'm not suggesting you're somehow withholding things, but any leader gets into a position where they learn what they share and how they share it. And I don't get it right off the bat, but it is also an understandable thing. If I was on the team, I'd want more sooner. But let's take your example. When I've also seen leaders who stay too much in the peer relationship space with my people, they end up sharing information in a way that ends up undermining their own credibility because they were wanting to just connect with people. Again, this is back to the relational piece. So that's what I mean when we start getting into the day-to-day of what I think leadership is. I am not taking away from getting good data, making good decisions. I just want to recognize that great decisions that don't have clear vision fall apart, where the execution of it falls apart. So again, it's hard to make a bad decision, good execution, right? But plenty of good ideas can fall apart on the runway in terms of how people are mobilized or how they're connected or the climate that they're in to be able to make that happen. So that's at some point, your leadership will be tested on your ability to build relationships, and I'll be the first one to even press myself to say, well, what does that mean? Okay, so I can turn the camera on myself. But if I do say about conversations, I think now we're getting some harder edges around things because we can talk about kinds of conversations that leaders need to have, right? You can build a vocabulary around that. I think when it comes to the nature of relationships, you're also talking about what level of coordination do we need to engage in? What is my level of commitment to our agreed upon mutual thing that binds us together? Why are we here doing what we're doing?
So what I'm going to make I was like, should I ask this as a question or just make a statement? My assumption is
go for it.
What stops these conversations from happening is this level of what we should be calling curiosity, right? But this level of question asking, I'm just going to put it that way. My assumption is people feel like I should know.
Yeah.
And so asking these questions and asking you what is, what relationships and with whom, what's most important, or when, how do you define bringing you along? My assumption is, and perhaps this might be assumption from personal experience as well, which is you feel like you're being exposed as not knowing.
Yeah. There's vulnerability in it.
There's vulnerability. Yeah. Right. Like that somehow this is it hits imposter syndrome, right? It's gonna,
I think it does.
Right. How is asking these questions going to expose you? And now you're going to be found out that you don't really know what you're doing. Whereas I think we probably, now easy to say, maybe also hard to do, right? So as coaches, it's probably really easy for us to say.
I mean, in some ways, it might be why we're there. Ken, it might be why we're there in the first place, right? I mean, we might be there in the first place to just create a little bit of space for them to be able to put the thing on the table they've been holding on to anyway. I mean, that might be the, one of the reasons why. There are lots of reasons you have a coach, but certainly the idea of testing things out or trying to surface an assumption you've been holding on to that's been driving your behavior you didn't even know was driving your behavior.
Yeah. It just sounds like there's so many necessary conversations, right? Like,
well, can I highlight something you were just saying about, and I actually, it's funny the things that I've landed on that I find that I care about when it comes to what an organization can do from a leadership development perspective. And there is something about programmatically when I have a group of leaders who are in a similar space, maybe they have distance that they're not all in the same team, meaning I've reduced a little bit of that pressure on them that I have to be competing with the person next to me. But maybe I've got some people from different parts of the organization. If I can get them, if we're learning together programmatically, we can probably do a couple of things. One, we can reduce some of the isolation that they're going to feel. We're going to increase some peer learning. And part of it is because if you're in supply chain and I'm in commercial, I'm not super worried about, like, we're both in commercial and we're both fighting over the same next position. Kind of, that's just a reality. I want to recognize that's real. I don't want to pretend that somehow that's not going to be a dynamic. But if you and I are both, we have a shared desire, we've already got some self-selection pressures that have put us in the room together anyway, but we're likely facing things that we think we're alone in. And I know that that's a total inside baseball stuff, but for me as someone who thinks about developing leaders, relational skills are developed relationally. So, so really, the kind of space you create for people to be able to, appears to be able to have those conversations together where they actually can do a little bit of, you face that, I face that, that's hugely powerful. And you don't get there overnight, but you can be thoughtful about the way you create those things. And this, if we think about, never forget, I can tell you one of my most positive pandemic memories was transitioning a 3-day face-to-face director level program that we transitioned over. And again, everybody was figuring it out as they went along. But we turned this into 8 sessions over, and again, no session was over 2.5 hours long, right? Sitting for 2.5 hours, right? But the idea that we did it over the week, is it the exact same experience? No, it's not. But what our compass point in switching things over when we were going to this idea that leaders aren't going to stop developing. We can't stop. In fact, they're going to need it more than ever before. Here was the one thing we couldn't lose. We couldn't lose taking a group of, if it was face to face with a group of 25 directors in that room, what you would have seen is the sheer number of ways we would have gotten them interacting in different cohorts, different permutations, and it of course, there's good stuff and tools they're walking away with, but the building of the network was primary.
Yep.
And our goal was, when we were doing this virtually, we're going to utilize every feature within Zoom around breakouts and all these kinds of, and we did it. And it was, and it was the thing that I was probably most proud of, was getting to the end of that week and having people saying, and this isn't about tooting my own horn. It was happy that we could actually create this something where people actually felt a sense of connection, and they were actually able to share real challenges they were facing. And also even reducing the perceived difference across this group, because you're in supply chain and because we must deal with different things. And how quickly you start realizing, oh, you deal with that, I deal with that. So I think there is something in how we create conditions for learning for leaders, which is relational in general. If you don't know those things, it's got to be hard to help people build those relationship skills.
Yeah. So me close this section with a few thoughts.
Yeah, please.
When I've done, so from my time in HR, when we've done so I generally come from the place of like, I don't feel like things I've designed are like done, right? Like I always keep learning, always keep tweaking. So from all the program sort of feedback that I've gathered, especially in my time in HR, the three things always come out that people loved and wanted more of, right? The assessments. People always love the wavy lines and dots and graphs.
Data about myself. Love it.
Data
Tell
about
me
myself.
about me. Yeah.
Yep. Any program that came with coaching, that's, I'm not even rank
Very
ordering
powerful.
these, not rank ordering these.
Of course.
But the assessment, the coaching, the peer interaction, not even necessarily the content, right? The peer interaction.
No.
And I think what you said that, so what's fun about this conversation is you're saying a lot of things that I've felt, but maybe not thought of exactly as explicitly and intentionally. I love what you said around reducing the feeling of isolation, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen that time and time again. The classic example I give from my own background is when we were bringing corporate leaders in from the head office with restaurant managers or regional directors, and it dawns on them in the first hour or two of the program, like, oh, you're dealing with the exact same leadership problems as I am.
I've spent the last year talking about how corporate doesn't understand what we're going through, and then in about 2 hours, you've broken that apart. I think that's
you
great.
do, yeah. So I love that. That was just a aha for me. And then, interestingly, I think that's also where the power of one-on-one coaching comes from. But let me back up before I finish that thought, which is, I think that's what's missing in push e-learning content, right?
Yeah.
Is to what you're saying here is the relational, learning happens relationally. Because I also think there's accountability that comes with learning in a relational
the social element of it.
Right? So even if you are going to push an asynchronous bit of learning out there, I do think you need to follow that up with at least a short session where you're bringing people together that all watch that same thing to talk about it, or have an assignment, go do something with this, and now let's get together and talk about it. But let me come back to coaching, which is, if you can't do it as a group, I do think that is one of the powers in coaching too, is a coach's ability to say, is to help reduce the terminal uniqueness feeling, right? Is to say, like, you're not alone. This is, and I don't mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying you're cliche. I'm just saying you're not the first person to deal with this, and you're not alone. This is a classic challenge. You're in good company, actually.
Yeah.
And
you're exactly where you're supposed to be. A little. Yeah. There's a little bit of that.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
For the sake of time, I'm going to give us a violent shove into our advice section. So what's your big advice for leaders out there?
My big advice is, it's funny because going back, you were talking about the thing that they don't talk about, of the three things you recall that they don't talk about, is content, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there's something where that has been a humbling experience for me in my career, which is certainly early on, I was you gotta have the killer content. And then at some point you just start recognizing it's not the content's unimportant, but it's merely a starter to things that are going to be created along the way. So having said that, I think to myself, like, what is it that I could give somebody that isn't totally contextually based, totally situationally based? And I guess I do think about the role that a framework plays. Now, I don't know if a framework counts as content. I just don't know. But to me, a useful, healthy framework is something that helps me make sense of what's in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a map. It allows me to, if this is here, this is here, this has this relationship to that. So 2 things that come to mind for me. Number 1 is do you have, as a leader, have you come across yet a metacognitive framework of your own thinking? And the quickest and easiest one is generally Arder's ladder of inference, right? And so the idea of a ladder of inference, it's just a nested way that our brains work.
Mm-hmm.
So there's stuff happens, and then we do stuff with it. So if the simplest version is stuff happened, I create a narrative around that, I draw conclusions from it, I add emotion to it, and then I tend to act from it, right? And why I say that's a metacognitive tool is it helps me not just be in my thinking, but look at my thinking. And what I would say to any leader is if you don't have something that helps you look at your thinking, to separate out the component parts, a way to recognize that, I saw this, I added this showed up, and then I did or said this. If you don't have something around that, I think it's very hard to actually engage any level of not even behavior change, because everything I'm talking about is upstream from your behavior, right? It's do you have a useful Swiss Army knife for your own thinking? That's the way I guess I would put that. That's one.
I like it.
Right. And then number two, and in sessions I'll often talk about our intent for speaking, like what is our motivation for speaking up, and I tend to have two lists. And one list says things like to better understand, to deepen the relationship, like all the things we know we're supposed to do. And then on the other side, it's to win, not lose, to punish, to blame, and and I use this as a way to try to start tipping into something which is you are like a lot of us would love to claim one chart and say we never do the other, and I get that. So do I. Now, I'm a lot. Now, after 30 years of doing this, I'm a lot more comfortable going, actually, I was just blaming you. Or, you know what? At that point, I was just really trying to win. Or I was actually just trying to punish you. And I'm not so precious about the fact that there are moments where my motivations shift. And if I can get a leader to recognize, and whether or not you want to call that their shadow or like the moments where they tip into the things they're not most proud of, I would say the only thing that matters is to recognize that our behaviors do tend to be downstream of our motivations when we speak. And it's okay to give yourself space for the idea that at that moment, I actually was trying to win that interaction. Cool. We're not going to judge it. But the moment we try and say, oh, no, and then we engage plausible deniability. No, I was just trying to actually get clarity on something. And it's like, okay, that's okay. It could also just be you wanted to win. And again, this is our coaching relationship. But if I can give a leader a tool that gives them the space to engage a bit of self-honesty to say, what happens when I tip into the protective space? And how does that show up? And the reason I say that for any leader is those are going to be the moments that people remember about you that you won't remember at all.
Right.
Like you'll have the moment where you were like, I was having a bad day. And for somebody else, that's the thing they'll talk about. Not because I need you to have a whole lot of pressure, but just being able to catch that a little bit earlier.
Right.
I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
Those are two things I'd give.
Love that. Yeah. Building, intentionality, right? How can you show up with intentionality? So,
and you're not going to get it right, by the way. Like you're not going to get it right every day.
No,
like you're going to have bad days, and you're gonna speak and totally wish you never opened your mouth, and that's cool. Can you be honest enough about what you did want in that moment, as opposed to shifting into what's the most virtuous version of my bad behavior?
Yeah. So, what's your advice for the HR folks out there, senior leaders who are supporting other leaders in their journey? What should they be doing?
The good news with that is I think we've talked about it, which is how do you create spaces where leaders at levels can actually have those pure conversations? You give them good content, right? But you can get them in the same room. And by the way, even if the same room is Zoom, that's fine. But how do we create the spaces where the content becomes the inspiration to the things that we need to be talking about, to building the healthier climate, especially with the leaders who are actually creating the climate? That's probably, and since I won't say much more about it because we've already had, I think, a good thought around that, but that's probably relational skills are learned relationally.
Nice. Well, and so the final part is, I know Ninth Edge is in Chicago, you're in Chicago, but for the listeners out there who want a little more Kyle Courtaway or Ninth Edge in their lives, where can people find you? What are you all trying to lean into?
Yeah, well, so you can find us at ninthedge.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. And we do we do spend time trying to create intentional leadership development experiences. And I will say experiences, leading experiential learning, how you get people doing, talking, right? Those kinds of things. So
Nice.
That's the place where we love to play. That's the place where we have a ton of passion. And because experiences like that don't just teach skills, they create networks. They also create climate inside the organization. So for any of us who are actually going to set aside time to get 25 people in a room, you can't do just one thing. You got to do it all at the same time. And that's something we get a lot of energy out of.
Awesome. Well, this has been a very fun conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Kyle, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
And thank you.